My name is Claire, and last month, I learned something I'll never forget. Never underestimate someone because of their job, especially when that job is saving lives. But let me go back to the beginning. It was my stepsister Sophia's wedding, the kind of wedding people post about on social media for months. Soft golden lights hanging from the ceiling, white flowers covering every table, a small band playing near the dance floor, and in the center of it all, Sophia, wearing a bright white dress, smiling like she owned the entire room. I stood near the entrance for a moment, holding a small gift box, wearing a simple dress. Nothing flashy, nothing expensive, just something comfortable. To be honest, I wasn't expecting anyone to notice me. That's how it had always been with Sophia and me. We grew up in the same house, but our lives were completely different. After my father passed away, my mother married Sophia's father. From the outside, we became one family. But inside those walls, things were never that simple. Sophia had everything growing up: private schools, luxury vacations, designer clothes. Meanwhile, I worked part-time jobs through college and eventually became a nurse. I never complained. I love my job. I remember sitting by my father's hospital bed when I was young, watching the nurses care for him. They were so gentle, so patient. I wanted to be that for someone someday, helping people, caring for strangers during their worst moments. It gave my life meaning. But Sophia always saw things differently. To her, success meant money, status, appearances. And tonight, her wedding had all of those things. Waiters moved through the room with trays of champagne. Guests wore expensive suits and sparkling jewelry. I found an empty seat near the end of one of the long tables. From there, I could see Sophia moving through the crowd. She looked happy, really happy. Her groom, Daniel, stayed close beside her, introducing her to different guests. Daniel seemed like a decent man from what little I knew. Calm, polite, very different from Sophia's usual personality. After about 20 minutes, the dinner service began. Guests returned to their seats. Plates were placed on the tables. The room filled with the sound of forks and quiet conversations. That's when Sophia suddenly stood up. She tapped her glass with a spoon. The soft ringing sound spread across the room. "Everyone," she called happily. The conversation slowly faded. "I want to introduce someone to Daniel's family." She turned her head and looked directly at me. Dozens of eyes followed her gaze. My stomach tightened. "Claire," Sophia said loudly. She waved her hand toward me. "Come here for a second." I wasn't expecting that, but refusing would only make things awkward. So I stood up and walked toward the main table. Guests watched quietly as I approached. Sophia placed a hand on my shoulder when I reached her. Her smile looked friendly, but I knew that smile. I had seen it many times growing up. It was the smile she used right before making a joke at someone else's expense. She turned toward Daniel's family, sitting nearby. "This," she said, gesturing toward me, "is my stepsister." Then she laughed lightly, and before anyone could ask questions, she paused, just long enough to build attention. "She's just a nurse." A few people at the table chuckled politely. Someone muttered, "Oh, that's nice." I felt the familiar wave of embarrassment rise in my chest, but I kept my face calm. I simply smiled. I had learned a long time ago that arguing with Sophia only made things worse. So I stayed quiet. For a moment, the conversation around the table continued. People picked up their glasses again. Someone changed the subject. I thought that would be the end of it. But then something unexpected happened. Across the table, Daniel's father suddenly stopped eating. He was an older man. Silver hair, sharp eyes. At first, I thought he was just listening to the conversation. But then, I noticed something strange. He was staring directly at me. Not casually, not politely. He was studying my face, like he was trying to remember something important. For a moment, the conversation at the table continued normally. Glasses clinked. People talked about the food. Someone nearby laughed at a joke. But Daniel's father looked distracted. He slowly placed his fork down, leaned back in his chair, still thinking about something. Daniel noticed the change in his father's expression. "Dad, everything okay?" The older man nodded, but his attention still seemed somewhere else. "Yes, I'm fine," he said quietly. Then he looked around the table for a moment, almost like he was organizing his thoughts. Sophia didn't notice any of this. She was busy talking about the honeymoon plans. "We're going to Italy first," she said excitedly. "Rome, then the Amalfi Coast." Daniel smiled. "We deserve something unforgettable." Several guests smiled and congratulated them again. The waiter returned and began serving the next course. Plates were replaced. Fresh glasses were filled. The music from the band became a little louder. Everything looked like a normal wedding reception. But Daniel's father still seemed thoughtful. After a moment, he turned slightly toward Daniel. "Son," he said quietly, "what did she say her stepsister's name was?" Daniel glanced toward me. "Claire." The older man repeated the name slowly, like he was testing it in his mind, like it was connected to an old memory. Sophia laughed lightly. "Oh, don't worry about Claire," she said with a playful smile. "She spends most of her life inside hospitals." More polite chuckles came from a few guests. But Daniel's father didn't react to the joke. Instead, he turned slightly toward me. Not accusing, not suspicious, just curious. For a moment, he looked like someone searching through old memories. Then, he spoke slowly. "I'm sorry," he said politely. "Have we met somewhere before?" The question caught me off guard. I shook my head slightly. "I'm not sure," I replied. "I meet a lot of people through work." He nodded slowly. "That makes sense." He looked down at the table again. For a moment, it seemed like he was about to say something else. But he stopped, like the answer was still just out of reach. Across the table, Daniel leaned closer to his father. "You really think you recognize her?" The older man shrugged. "I don't know, there's just something familiar." Sophia waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, please," she said with a laugh. "Claire's not famous." A few guests smiled awkwardly. But this time, the laughter felt forced, because Daniel's father was still thinking. He rubbed his chin slowly, then looked back at me again. Not intensely this time, just thoughtfully. "Strange," he murmured. "I feel like I've seen you during a very important moment in my life." The table grew a little quieter. Even Sophia stopped talking for a second. But before anyone could ask more questions, the band suddenly started playing a louder song. Guests nearby clapped. Several people stood up and walked toward the dance floor. Sophia quickly stood up as well. "Perfect," she said cheerfully. "Time for dancing." She grabbed Daniel's hand and pulled him toward the dance floor. Other guests followed. But Daniel's father stayed seated for a moment longer. He looked at the dance floor, then back at me. Finally, he stood up slowly and said something that made my curiosity grow even stronger. "I'm sure of one thing," he said quietly. "We definitely met somewhere important." Then he walked toward the dance floor, and for the rest of the evening, I kept wondering, what moment was he trying to remember? The music in the hall grew louder. Guests were laughing, dancing, raising their glasses. For a while, the strange moment at the table seemed to fade away. But I could still feel Daniel's father thinking about something. Even from across the room, I noticed him glancing in my direction a few times, while people danced around him, almost like a memory was slowly coming back. About 20 minutes later, the band stopped for a short break. People returned to their seats, catching their breath, drinking water. Daniel's father walked back to the table and sat down again. This time, he looked more certain, like something in his mind had finally connected. He looked at me again, but now there was recognition in his eyes. He leaned forward slightly. "Claire," he said slowly. "Yes," I replied. For a second, he didn't speak. Then he asked something that made the entire table pause. 3 years ago, Were you working at St. Mary's Hospital? My heart skipped. Yes, I answered carefully. The older man exhaled slowly, like a puzzle piece had finally clicked into place. I knew it, he whispered. Daniel looked confused. Knew what, Dad? Daniel's father turned toward his son. His voice was calm, but emotional. 3 years ago, I was in a terrible car accident. The room grew quiet around us. I was rushed to the emergency room in critical condition, he continued. He paused. The roads were blocked that night because of a massive protest downtown. Most of the doctors were delayed trying to get to the hospital. Several guests leaned closer, listening. For nearly 3 hours, he continued slowly. There was only one nurse who stayed with me. He pointed gently toward me. That nurse was Claire. The table went completely silent. I felt dozens of eyes turn toward me. He continued speaking, his voice filled with gratitude. She monitored my breathing, checked my pulse. She kept talking to me, so I wouldn't lose consciousness. He looked at Daniel. If she had walked away even once, I might not have survived until the doctors arrived. Daniel stared at me in shock. You saved my dad. I shook my head slightly. I was just doing my job. But Daniel's father shook his head firmly. No, he said. You did much more than that. He turned slowly toward Sophia, and his expression changed. The warmth in his voice disappeared. You introduced her as just a nurse, he said calmly. The room was silent now. No one left, no one moved. You shouldn't say just a nurse about someone who saves lives. Sophia's face turned pale. For the first time that evening, she had nothing to say. Daniel's father looked back at me. If it wasn't for you, he said quietly, I wouldn't be sitting here today, watching my son get married. Daniel stood up from his chair, walked around the table toward me. Then he extended his hand. Thank you, he said sincerely. I mean that. Some of the guests began whispering softly. Others looked embarrassed about laughing earlier. One older woman near the table even shook her head at Sophia disapprovingly. I suddenly felt uncomfortable being the center of attention. So I smiled politely. Like I said, I was just doing my job. But Daniel's father spoke again. And you did it better than anyone could have. The band started playing music again in the background. The reception slowly returned to its usual energy. But something had clearly changed. People now looked at me differently, not as the quiet stepsister in a simple dress, but as someone who had done something meaningful. Across the room, I noticed Sophia's expression. Her earlier confidence was completely gone. She kept glancing toward our table, then quickly looking away. For the rest of the evening, she avoided making eye contact with me. Completely. The woman who had spent years putting me down now couldn't even look in my direction. Later that night, Daniel's father found me near the dessert table. He placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. I never got to thank you properly, he said. After the accident, I asked the hospital who the nurse was. They told me your name. I tried to find you, but you had already gone back to your shift, helping someone else. He paused, his eyes glistening. And then, life got in the way. I never forgot you, but I never got the chance to say thank you. He looked at me with deep gratitude. Until tonight, I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled. He nodded slowly. Tonight, my son married into a family that has a woman like you. He glanced toward Sophia across the room. And a woman like her. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The contrast was clear to everyone who was paying attention. As I drove home that night, I thought about the strange journey of the evening. I came to the wedding as the invisible stepsister, the one Sophia always made fun of, the one with the just a nurse job. But I left as someone else, someone seen, someone recognized, not for money, not for status, for something that actually mattered, for being there when someone needed me. That was last month. Sophia hasn't spoken to me since the wedding. She avoids family gatherings now, especially if Daniel's father is there. And I heard from Daniel that his father never lets her forget what she said that night. Not in a mean way, just truthful reminders that some jobs matter more than money. I heard from my mother that she's been unusually quiet, that her confidence took a hit she didn't see coming. Meanwhile, Daniel's father calls me every few weeks, just to check in. Sometimes he sends flowers to the hospital where I work. The card always says the same thing. Thank you for not walking away. Here's what that night taught me. Sophia spent her whole life believing that money and status made her better than me. She thought being a nurse was something to laugh at, something to make fun of in front of her new family. But when the truth came out, when the room learned that I was the reason Daniel's father was still alive, her jokes didn't matter anymore, because you can laugh at someone's job, but you can't laugh at someone who saved a life. My name is Claire, and I'm still a nurse.